Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Deirdre O'Shaughnessy, and I'm delighted to be here with you this evening to interview Sally Hayden, the author of My Fourth Time We Drowned. This book has won a rake of awards. It's won the 2022 Orwell Prize for Political Writing. It's been named the An Post Irish Book of the Year. It's won the Michelle Dion Award, and a host of other awards. Sally is currently the Irish Times Africa correspondent, but she's also worked for The Guardian, CNN, pretty much every media outlet you've ever heard of, and quite a few I had never heard of. And she's originally from Dublin, but don't hold that against her now, this is Cork Road. So Sally's going to start off with us by introducing the book a little bit and reading from it. Take it away, Sally.
Thank you, Deirdre, and thanks everyone for coming. This is the book, My Fourth Time We Drowned. It's now in paperback, which I think means it's half the price, and it's for sale here, so if anyone wants to read it, they can. I'm going to read a bit from the prologue, but I just need to explain how this part came about. Basically, in 2018, which is where the book begins, I got a message just out of nowhere from someone who said that they were in Libya, and it came through Facebook. I was living in London at the time. I was actually living in a very confusing way. I was subletting and I didn't really live anywhere, but I was moving around and reporting as well. And on Facebook, I got this message that said, "Hi, Sister Sally, we need your help. We're under bad condition in Libya prison. If you have time, I will tell you all the story." And so I responded kind of a bit confused and just said, you can talk to me. I'm a journalist. I can't help you directly. I didn't want anyone to think that I was promising something that I couldn't give. And I said, tell me what's going on. So this man said that he was one of around 500 people, men, women, and children, that they had been locked up in what he called a prison. It later turned out to be a detention center in Libya, which is in North Africa, and that they had been trapped in the center for months. They had been locked up and abused, and then a war had broken out around them the previous day, and the guards who had been locking them inside had basically run away and left them. And so he said, this is potentially a life or death situation. We can hear the sounds of warfare around us. We're defenseless, we're thin, we haven't eaten properly in years, and we need help. And please, can you tell the world basically what's happening? So I was like, can this be real? How could somebody be contacting me? Why me in the first place? I kept talking. I did everything I could to verify this. I asked for GPS locations, asked for, selfies, contacts for family members. We talked on the phone, everything I could think of. I also contacted a journalist who I knew in Tripoli, the capital of Libya, and I said, this sounds strange, but did a war just break out? And he said, yes, it did. And I said, this specific neighborhood, could there be people that have been locked up in a building there? And he said, yes, that's a migrant detention center. And so at that point, I started contacting NGOs and the UN, and I was basically Googling who works in Libya and contacting them and saying, this sounds strange, but I think that there's this group of hundreds of people in this area and they need help. And answers came I don't know if they were quick, but anyway, answers came and they said, there are hundreds of people who have been locked up there, but we can't get to them basically because it's too dangerous. So at that point, I was like, wow, this is real, and so I kept talking to these people. They were sending me more and more information. After about 24 hours, nothing had happened. No one had come to help them. And I, because I was freelance, and I think it was a Sunday as well, freelance journalist, it takes time to get a response. You send emails to editors, they might not respond that quickly. So I was thinking maybe I wouldn't get something published for a while. So I started posting on Twitter screenshots of the messages, and it ended up being a Twitter thread that got eventually millions of views, and kind of morphed into something much greater than what I had originally thought it was going to be. And sorry, this is a long introduction, but it's kind of important just for people who don't know the book to explain. What it turned out was that these hundreds of people were where they were in the danger they were in because of European Union migration policy, because they had tried to cross the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe. They'd been caught by the Libyan Coast Guard, forced back to Libya, locked up indefinitely, and were basically being abused kind of with impunity. And so, yeah, I was thinking if I help these people, that'll be the end of it. It must have been like an accident that this has happened. And what I discovered basically took over years of my life reporting this story. And yeah, so the part that I'm going to read is from there. Sorry, I feel like I'm feeling nervous. Maybe it's the slides. So if my voice starts shaking, I'm not crying. I'm just, I'm just feeling nervous. Anyway.
Do you want to take a moment? I have more to say if you want to have a drink.
If you want to.
Yeah, that's fine. Take a moment there. As Sally has outlined there, years of research, relationship building, travel and persistence have gone into this book. Can I just get a show of hands? Who's read the book? Okay, about half and half. Good. So we won't give you any spoilers. But if you've read the book, you can see that that's really clear how long the research took and how much research has gone into this. And she's personalised the narrative as well through a number of different individual stories. It's a really clever device, but it never allows you to lose sight of that bigger picture story around the EU and the politics of this and the decisions that are made and how they impact on those individual narratives. So that's kind of the structure, I guess, of the book and where it's positioned. If you want to start your reading there.
So, what does your phone mean to you? Is it a way to chat to friends or swipe through dating apps? Do you take selfies, send voice notes or Snapchats? Is it a vital source of information? Has it saved your life? What would it represent if you were incarcerated? Its little screen your only window to the outside world? What would it be like to spend months or years in the same building without one? Could you share a phone with 500 others? Would you risk being tortured to keep it, or forego eating to buy data, knowing you would starve without food but could disappear forever if you had no way of sending a distress call? What is it like to watch innocent people being shot through Facebook Messenger? How would you feel listening to their faltering voices as they mentally and physically withered away? That's what I was going to discover. Originally, I believed those first contacts in Libya were an anomaly, the isolated victims of an accidental oversight. Once these people were helped, I thought, my job would be done. I was wrong. Within days, more and more detained refugees began contacting me. They got my number from friends or found what I'd been posting online. They sent messages through Twitter and WhatsApp. Their stories were eerily similar. For years after that first message came, in August 2018, I messaged refugees and migrants in different Libyan detention centres every day. I imagined the network of hidden phones, the connections between me and them, between them and their families or friends like lifelines, arteries pumping blood. I could not fathom the bravery of the people I spoke to. We talked about the dangers of going public, but if a source wanted to take that risk, I respected their choice. Some were beaten up or tortured on suspicion of sending information. Their phones were regularly confiscated. Still now, I often receive videos, photos, or audio I cannot share. Missing people and evidence of atrocities accumulate in my phone's photo album, in between pictures of autumn leaves or friends' babies. I set WhatsApp to save media automatically, because detained refugees send me videos they cannot keep for safety reasons, and I do not want to risk them failing to download. I was getting so many messages at one stage that it was almost impossible to read them all. These images are a sharp reminder of the world's growing disparities. People are more able to communicate than ever before, yet routes to safety are being shut down. Citizens in the West can look away, despite windows everywhere, phone screens, TV broadcasts, videos posted online, providing insight into our vast inequality. Anyone who does open their eyes may end up bearing witness to human rights abuses thousands of miles away without any ability to intervene. I wrote this book because I wanted to document the consequences of European migration policies from the point that Europe becomes undeniably ethically culpable when refugees are forcibly turned away. 70 years after the global refugee system began, we are locking people up for trying to seek safety. We force them out of sight and fortify systems that make it easy for us to forget about them. Some die in captivity, and others will be traumatized for life. This book will recount human stories, as well as giving some insight into the systemic issues destroying lives: negligence, corruption, apathy, inequality. It is not a comprehensive account of everything that is happening to people who try to reach Europe, or even to those who are caught by the Libyan Coast Guard. There are new abuses, new humiliations every day, but I hope it plays some role in the quest for accountability. You know, sorry, there's one part that I only thought of the last time I read that, which I think is nice to mention, I guess. In the paperback, there's an update on what has happened since the book was published, and I'm going to forget some of the things now, but in November, it was cited in a submission to the International Criminal Court calling for named EU officials to be investigated and potentially prosecuted for crimes against humanity. And also, there's one chapter in it on Rwanda and that reporting, and I think the book also was cited in the legal challenge against the British Home Office, trying to stop the deportations of people to Rwanda, which has initially failed and now has succeeded in Court of Appeal. And also, the reporting in it, I know, has been at least used or read by prosecutors who are in the Netherlands, who are now trying to quite infamous traffickers whose stories are told in the book, one of whom was at loose and then has recently been recaught and is going to be extradited to the Netherlands, and the other is already now in the Netherlands. And I think, I don't know technically at the point that he goes on trial, but I know he's having hearings anyway, so. Oh. Yeah, I always like, when I read that now, I'm like, oh, I guess it like played some role anyway.
Absolutely.
So,
no,
yeah.
Well, that's really positive, because anybody who has read the book, how angry you would be about him getting away with it, essentially. That's good to hear that he hasn't gotten away with it fully anyway. Okay, so I'm going to rewind a little bit to before you got that message and the work you were doing before that, which obviously prompted people to go to you as a person who was interested in this. What sparked your interest in migration in the first place? How did you start reporting on this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, like, for people who work in journalism, as I'm sure you know, you don't necessarily choose your specialization. It's kind of like, when I was in college, I went to UCD, and I was in the student newspaper, and I thought I wanted to be a music journalist. They used to send me out and do all the interviews of musicians, and then I studied law, so I was interested in law, and I thought maybe I'll be a lawyer, and then I started getting internships, working in news, and basically realized that I knew absolutely nothing about the world and had no idea. Like, I just had so much to learn. And then, yeah, as you do, I kind of just started learning more and more. I started doing a bit of international reporting, and I eventually got a job in Vice News in London, where I was effectively at one point the only staff journalist outside of the US, so I had to cover like everything in the world, basically. So
no problem.
That was really hard. And we also didn't have wires, which like a lot of news
agents. God.
Yeah, so it was like I was like literally covering everything. I mean, not, but I was meant to be trying. So anyway, yeah, at that time, that was 2014 that I started, and then 2015, lots of people know the year of kind of so-called European migrant crisis, and so I was covering more and more shipwrecks, and at the same stage, we were already having that thing of like, how much do we cover this? How many people, it's horrible, but like how many people have to die for this to be a news story, basically. And yeah, that was, at the time I was like not particularly interested in migration, but I was just covering it from the desk in London. And then August 2015, I think it was David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, said there are swarms of migrants in Calais. He used this term. And me and my editor were just sitting there, and we were like, what does that mean? He said, there's swarms of migrants trying to get into the UK, basically, from Calais. And we were like, what does that mean? Like, who are these people? And, you know, how are they trying to get, like, how does the whole thing work? We just didn't understand. So I had, like, not really been allowed to leave my desk very much for, like, the preceding year, and had been given... Basically, I was like, just send me, like, please send me. I will go. I will figure out what's going on, and I will do good coverage. And he was like, okay. So at the time, I had, like, 1,000 business cards that my work had given me that I had never really got to use. So I like took a big stack of my business cards, went over to Calais with a photographer from Vice, and we spent 3 days there, and we basically just talked to everybody we could, and we met so many people from so many different countries, and started to understand like the dynamics of what was happening, and also to understand that like the way that things are portrayed in the media are not really the same as the way that they are on the ground. And that was true on like a number of different levels. But one thing that I did when I was there, I just gave everyone business cards, said stay in touch, and let me know if there's anything you think we should be covering, because we work for Vice as well. We had just done this big documentary. They got famous for like infiltrating ISIS. So like a lot of the people who were coming in, because our international coverage was very good, they already knew Vice. So they'd be like, yeah, of course, like we love Vice. You guys do good international coverage. Like this was in film, not in text, which was just me, but the film was good. And so yeah, people would stay in touch with me, and quite a few of the people I met then made it to the UK and contacted me when they got there, and like we'd meet up. And then I left Vice the following year, but I had all these contacts, and one of the guys, Ziad Gandor, who was from Syria, he was like an English literature graduate, and he had not worked as a journalist, but basically did this journey all the way from Syria to the UK, he'll say basically by Google Maps, and met so many journalists along the route that he was like, I want to be a journalist now as well. It seems like a great job. So we were talking about story ideas, and he had this idea about an investigation. Or I don't think he said it could be an investigation, but he told me that he knew of Syrians who were trying to return home. And at the time, this is 2017 now, but at the time the big story was like, all the Syrians want to come here, and it's always painted as everybody wants to come here, and they're invading our space basically. And he was like, no, like he knew so many people trying to go back, but like what would happen is the ones who actually made it back would disappear and nobody would hear from them. And so we were like, we need to figure out what's going on. I was like, that should be an investigation, like let's figure that out. So we got together. He had a lot of contacts over Europe, so we met them. We got a grant from the Mary Raftery Fund, which was really great, like really helpful. And I was able to go to Syria. He obviously couldn't, because he'd be like he'd be in danger there, and he had refugee status in the UK. But I went to Syria, and basically what we found out was that people who returned home, particularly young men, were being arrested in the airport, detained, tortured, sometimes killed, and otherwise sent to the front lines and forced to fight. And so we published that story. It was actually, I think, the first and only Irish Times story that's ever been published in Arabic, by the way. I don't know if it's still up there, but yeah, we published that story, and it had like really, really major impact. Like, I know that it's been used in court cases in various different European countries. It was used in a big legal challenge against the German government, arguing that Syrians should be given a higher level of protection, particularly young men. And yeah, it also won like various awards and stuff. And that was kind of my first experience, because sometimes in journalism you're like, we're writing about this and it's not having any impact, and nobody cares, and you can get very depressed. But it was my first experience of being like, we found like a gap that nobody is actually reporting in depth, and sometimes you need to actually go, what's the part that's missing in this story, and how can I look into it? And we would have, if it had been like, what we had uncovered was that it was safe for people to go back to Syria, we would have published that. It could have gone either way, but yeah, what we published was actually very important, I think. And after that, I got another grant to go to Sudan. And I was meant to be looking into something totally different, or slightly different anyway. But basically, I got to Sudan, started meeting refugees. And Sudan, if people don't know, is kind of like beside Libya. So if people are escaping other countries in East Africa, for example, they'll tend to go through Sudan and maybe try to claim refugee status in Sudan, or then they'll go to Libya and try to cross to Europe. But a lot of people just end up in Sudan, and they just wait in Sudan, and they're hoping that they can be helped by the UN Refugee Agency particularly. And when I got there, I started speaking to refugees. This is 2017 still. And they were like, you need to report on corruption in the UN Refugee Agency. They were like, basically, UNHCR staff are taking bribes of like tens of thousands of dollars from people to resettle them, you know, the so-called legal route to bring them to safe countries in Europe or in the US or North America. And they were like, there's no way basically to be considered for that program unless you pay huge amounts of money, and even then it's not reliable. And they were like, basically the whole system is corrupt, we have no faith in it. And at the same stage, they were being exploited constantly by the police, you know. One thing that it can be hard to understand, I think, is how expensive and how difficult it can be to stay still, you know. And when people, I think, in Europe sometimes talk about the next safe country they might consider at that time, they might have been like, oh, Sudan's like a safe country for refugees, but actually, like, refugees, because they lack like proper documents and they're seen as vulnerable, they can just be exploited by everybody. So like, people there were just being constantly exploited by security forces, you know. There was all sorts of violence and abuse happening, particularly against women. And anyway, so they were like, look into this. I was like no, or I didn't say no, but I was like, you know, I was always thinking that UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, is like this amazing agency the good guys. So I was like kind of skeptical, but I talked to more and more people, and eventually I gathered like quite a lot of, you know, testimonies at least. And I took it to an editor. They said, you need somebody internal to UNHCR to tell you this is happening, or we won't run it. And so it took me 10 months of kind of looking into this, but I was doing lots of other work as well. And eventually I did get someone internal in UNHCR Sudan who said, yeah, this is happening as well. And so we ended up running the story. And all this time, by the way, I had been going back and forward to UNHCR saying, I've gathered this evidence, what do you say? Then go back, I gathered this, and they'd always deny everything. And then we published this story May 2018, the 15th of May, I think, and 2 days later, UNHCR suspended resettlement nationwide and said that they were deploying an anti-fraud team. And basically after that, various things happened, which I won't go into, but I was told by a senior UN staff member that there was an attempt to discredit me. There were like various things that happened. Yeah, I'm not going into here. Anyway, this is a long story, but basically this then corruption probe was happening. And for me, that was like very enlightening, because it was one example of like what we see, you know, if you're like a journalist with very limited, which I've been, because I've sat on a desk and covered this, you know, if you're a journalist and you don't have a direct line to a refugee in X country, you go to the UNHCR and you say what's happening, and then you quote whatever they say as fact. Yep. And so this was my first experience of being like, actually, the people on the ground do not have faith in this system as it stands, and the people that I've been quoting as the experts on this are the ones that they don't have faith in. So anyway, long story short, the Facebook message that I got, I didn't realize at the time, but the person who contacted me, his brother was in Sudan and knew of the reporting that I had done on UNHCR, and that was why they contacted me, I think. Not particularly because that reporting, but because they were like, oh, there's a journalist who like talks to refugees. So yeah, that was how this whole book came about, but it's kind of a long way of, very long explanation, but it's kind of, it's an example of, I didn't decide to report on migration so much as it was like, you know, you do one thing and then you do another, and then someone gets in touch and then someone points you in this direction, and then you win an award, and then an editor says, will you do more on that? Or someone gives you a grant. I think it was only like pretty recently that I was like, I guess I report on this. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's that editor who sent you to Calais first. Like, I presume he's got loads of thank yous. And
yeah, he's thanked in the book and came to the book launch. So
good. He can credit himself with starting a great career anyway. One thing that kind of came to me repeatedly while I was reading this, and you refer to it in your afterword actually, is people may know of the story of Kevin Carter, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist who took a very famous photo of a starving child in Sudan being attacked by a vulture, who struggled with that and with his experiences so much that he later took his own life. And you referenced that in your afterword, and I think that's always a struggle for journalists, of whether you can stand outside of a story and observe it, and how involved you get and how emotionally involved you get. I mean, I can reading this book, it's very clear that you develop quite strong personal connections with people in order to tell their stories. And it's very difficult then to sort of step back and say, well, this is a professional relationship when maybe you are the only person they have had to turn to. How do you deal with that, and how do you kind of enforce that boundary?
Yeah, like it's a tricky one. I mean, I did have a few rules which I always try and keep to, and I learned quite early on that you never promise anything, because you have to be very careful with people in a desperate situation that you're not saying, you know, I don't know, I think maybe I say it, oh no, I don't say it in the book, but like even in Calais, I'd meet like people who'd be like, this journalist said she's gonna get me a, you know, not even big things, but like they're gonna come back and give me like, you know, a mattress or whatever, and they never came back, and the person will feel like they were conned into something, and I'm like very, you know, very clear, like I can't help you. I always say that at the beginning, like I can't even promise anything will get published, because you might like file a story for a newspaper and then the editor forgets to run it or whatever, you know, which happens, especially if you're freelance, you just don't know. So I always try, and you can't promise that anything will result if you get something published. I think that the really interesting and strange thing for me with this story was that the people who contacted me, they really, really wanted to be heard. And so I'd say, like, I can't help you. And they'd be like, we don't care. Just tell everybody what's happening. Like, we just want people to know we exist. We want them to hear our side of the story. And we want them to realize that we're basically alive and we're going through this. And that for me was like, because one of the things that I find a bit uncomfortable sometimes about journalism is when you have like a lot of people doing the same stories. For example, I was in Rwanda on the 20th anniversary of the genocide, and you'll have people come up to you who like, I mean, they probably are genocide survivors, you know, but they'll say, oh, I'll tell you my story if you give me like $10. And you're like, this is so uncomfortable, you know, that we're all, like, when you have journalists all circling one thing, and I just think there's so much information that needs to be found out and needs to be investigated and revealed, and I try and make it that I'm only speaking to people who want to tell me things or want me to publicize things, rather than people who, you know, I'm forcing traumatic information out of them, because I find that like really difficult, and you do feel like a vulture sometimes, you know, in those environments. Yeah, sorry, I forgot the full question.
Yeah, no, I think that nails it. You mentioned as well, like the power imbalance between you and the people you're dealing with, and obviously that's a commonality across all sorts of news stories where you're dealing with maybe people who've been bereaved or people after a court case or all sorts of things, and obviously in this case, particularly so because a lot of the reason they're coming to you is because nobody else in power has been listening to them.
Sorry, one thing that I did forget, another rule that I had, don't ever give advice. Like, I was very clear on that. I can never advise you on anything, because I'd have people who would say, you know, for example, should I pay a smuggler and go to sea? And I'm like, I can't say anything on that, because like I don't know how is it like your life is in danger where you are. Your life is in danger if you go to sea. I have no idea how anything will turn out. Like a journalist, you just don't give advice. You never. And I would pass on information, which I actually have met other journalists who say that they have issues with that. I would say, you know, they'd say, because it's so hard to get information when you're locked up in a detention center, you know, and you have a hidden phone and very limited data. Like they'd say, you know, is there any update on, are there evacuations happening, for example? And I'd say, well, the UN has issued this statement and they say this. And I would pass on that information, but I would never say, like, you should do this or you should do that. And I did find out afterwards, like I knew that could come back to bite me if I ever did that as well. And I did find out afterwards that there was at least one person who was in one detention center telling people that I had told them that they should all escape.
Wow.
And yeah, he'd be like, Sally says that we should all escape, because he knew that I was going to convince people to try escape with him. And then luckily I was in touch with other people in the center. They were all like, Sally wouldn't say that. But it was like this weird, like you're just at home in your, you know, room and wherever, like in your bedroom, and you're like messaging someone on a phone, and it's having these like potential repercussions. So sorry, that was just to be, that was my boundaries. Don't promise anything, and don't give advice.
Okay, and in terms of that power imbalance then, I suppose it's just how do you kind of deal with that in terms of your own ethics and your own, you mentioned about not kind of pulling traumatic stories out of people, which is something that journalists do regularly, in, again, as I say, all sorts of contexts. How do you kind of make sure that you're not overstepping the mark there? Like, what do you sort of have a constant reminder to yourself? Is it just that your habits are formed at this stage? Like, when you were newer to things, are the things you kind of, stories that you pursued or lines of questioning that you pursued with people that you would look back now and say, well, I wouldn't do that anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always learning, and it's very important that you're constantly questioning yourself. But I would never say that I've done nothing wrong. I'm sure that I've done so many things wrong, and I'm sure that I've done very insensitive things as well. I mean, I know that I have. Like, so I guess all you can do is be trying. I mean, one example, and this is a slightly different story, but I was in Niger in January, reporting on a kind of malnutrition crisis, and I was in a hospital with all these mothers. Actually, a lot of the fathers had gone off to Libya to try reach Europe, and the mothers had been left with the children, and they weren't able to feed them enough, and the children were malnourished and very, very sick in hospital, needing quite serious care. But we were going around, I had a translator, and we were asking, how did your child become malnourished? And the mother would say, my child isn't malnourished. And it turned out that, the word malnourished carries shame, because it's like that you can't take care of your child. And it took us a while, because it was in Hausa, so I can't remember the word, but whatever the word was, there was another way to phrase that was more sensitive, like maybe how did your child become sick or something like that, because we could get from the doctors that the child was malnourished. I don't need the mother to tell me that they're malnourished. And it was there are things like that I'm sure, I mean, all the time you're hurting people, but I think it's just, I always try and have a reason why I'm doing a story. I'll try and ask people, what do you want to happen? What do you want to be improved? What do you think that policymakers should know? What do you think the government should know? At least then there's a reason for them to be talking to you, rather than, and I always say that, I mean, always you say, you don't have to talk to me, it's up to you. But it was strange reporting on this book, because when I got those first messages, I was 28, I'm I'm not saying that's super young, but it's a bit young, and I was on freelance, and I was kind of not secure at all. And so it was and I was totally on my own. I wasn't working for an organization. I didn't know anyone who had been through this particular type of situation, and I didn't. There was no one really that I could talk to about a lot of this stuff. And so, you are, I don't know how to explain it. It was just, it's very isolating. And of course, I made many mistakes, and it totally took over my life, for literally years. And I mean, it's nice that I got it all together now. Nice is probably the wrong word for anyone who's read the book, but it was only after about a year that I was actually, I've gathered so much information now that maybe I should find a way to put it all together. But at the time, I was literally living day to day. I'd just be these people need help, these people need help, I need to pass this information on to these people, maybe I should publish this report. Always thinking maybe it's going to get better, and after a while you realize it's not getting better. And so I don't know.
Do you think that lack of an infrastructure in terms of a news organisation actually was a help to you? There's a lot of editors who probably would have said, oh, look, you've been rabbiting on about this thing now for ages. We need you to go and cover something else that's a bit sexier or whatever. Sorry, that is how we talk, unfortunately, in newsrooms, to people who are doing really worthy and important work. But do you think actually having the freedom maybe the freedom paid off in terms of the isolation that you had that as compensation for it?
Yeah, I mean, I've stayed freelance on purpose. That was, I mean, not initially. Initially, I lost my job, but as did everyone, as did a lot of people who were working in Vice all at the same time. But after that, I realized that I have freedom to choose what I think is important. And this story, I could not have stayed on this. I stayed reporting it for, until I finished the book, so 3 years. And I literally reported this for, pretty much everyone you can possibly imagine, everyone, New York Times, I did visual investigation with them, op-ed with them, Channel 4 News, we led the nightly news with a report, and I did some other reports with them, CNN, Al Jazeera, Irish Times. Irish Times, by the way, were the first ones to publish any story on this, so they've been publishing it all along, but and so many other places. I mean, even like German, Zeit in Germany, like they were translating my reports into German, and yeah, I could not have been kept publishing on the same topic for one place. I mean, the Irish Times, they did very regularly publish things, and like that's like a huge credit to them, and my editors there are amazing. But also, to be honest, I wanted to reach different audiences, so for me it wasn't enough to be publishing just in one outlet. I was like, every time, that was my thinking at the time, I was like, every time I do this in a different outlet, I reach more people. And yeah, I mean, but I was in this mindset, like, it's gonna make a difference. This one can make a difference, all the time. So yeah, and that's, I'm still freelance now. Like, I've stayed freelance partially because I just care so much about this topic and this story, and I want to be able to keep following it.
You've brought me nicely on to kind of my next question there about that idea of making a difference. There is, when you read this book, and even for, on a domestic level in terms of news stories, there's regular reports about direct provision centres, there's regular reports about, say, the fallout from mother and baby homes, there's regular reports about psychiatric hospitals, there's youth detention centres, there's all of these inequalities and difficulties that go on, and we have reporters who will pursue a particular story like that for years in a very dedicated way, and you look at them and you're like, 12 people have read that today. You're like, this reporter has spent months working on this investigation, but everyone is reading about Prince Harry or whatever. And there is oftentimes when say, we get these stories, and when you get a story like this, oh my God, if people knew about this. And then you put it out there, and people can know about it, and they choose not to. Is it very dispiriting to realise that people say authorities particularly, already do know? And that, like, a lot of this book is quite shocking in terms of, particularly around the UN and particularly around some of the aid agencies that a lot of us give our money to kind of in the hope that these things don't happen or that aren't allowed to continue happening, that they do know what's happening, and that they kind of are just merrily claiming their funding and paying their staff inordinate amounts of money and just sort of getting on with it. Like, at what point did you realise that they knew? And that it wasn't, the report was going to make, and it has made some differences, but that they weren't suddenly going to read this and go, we have to fix this.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think, of course, like, there were things that they overall knew, but like what I realized very, very quickly was that, certainly at the time that I started reporting this, basically nobody had direct communication with people inside detention. And so maybe they knew broadly that detention centers were bad, but like on a very granular level, like I became in touch with people in, I think the most at one time was about 10 or 11 detention centers, plus like unofficial kind of places of detention. And I'd be updating like this Twitter thread, just this happened today, these people haven't had food for 5 days, this aid was, stolen by X, like this, all this information like on a very basic level. And I realized very, very quickly that the aid agencies that were receiving the funding from the EU, by the way, to improve the conditions in the detention centers didn't know what was going on inside them. And I knew that because they started asking me for like both information and like conference calls. Like there was right at the beginning of this story, I think maybe 1 or 2 weeks in, I think I went to a music festival. I got like a free ticket with some friends to go to a music festival, and it was like a terrible idea to go, honestly, because I got there, I was just glued to my phone the whole time. I left early, I stayed like 1 day, but I was in a tent on a conference call with the heads of 2, I won't name them, but the heads of 2 major international NGOs that were working in Libyan detention centers. I was in a tent like in rural UK, and they were like, tell us what's happening here, tell us what's happening here. And I was like, this is displaying like I didn't write this book to say that I'm amazing. Like the only reason that I played such a major role was that the whole system was failing, and I was just a person who happened to be highlighting that. And like that for me was actually, I mean, that like it's hard to explain now, but like that was why I kept going on a day-to-day basis, because I was like literally, yeah, of course you can say overall like maybe nothing changed, but like on a small basis it would be like, these people haven't eaten for 5 days, and I would raise the alarm about that, and then food would arrive, and I met people, actually, a lot of the stuff I didn't know, but when I started meeting people who had got out of Libya, like years later, they would turn up and be like, remember this one time when you told these people about this thing, and and then that person was rescued or whatever, and I'd be like, oh my God, like that's really like emotional and also just disturbing to even imagine. So but it's tricky because I did all those reports. I was thinking maybe something will change, but basically, I mean, it's in the book. After about a year, I started having quite serious security issues, like threats to my life, and also I was put under criminal investigation for a year, and all of that kind of ended up like slowing down my reporting because I got quite scared and I got quite anxious and just basically didn't know how to deal with that. And I started feeling very guilty after that because I was like, I'm not reporting on the same level that I was, and like that's I don't know what damage that could have. It's really hard because you're always doing risk assessments, and it became that for me. It wasn't just about me, but I also was like, actually, if something happens to the sources, I mean, people, like there were issues where people were interrogated and asked questions about me in detention centers, and I was like, actually, I can't live with myself if something happens to those people because of something I've done. And so the kind of risk tilted, even though obviously that was always a risk and a conversation, and you're making things public in discussion with somebody who's in this environment. But afterwards I was like, maybe I became too scared, and part of like writing the book honestly was like a kind of atonement, because I was like, I have all this information, a lot of it wasn't public at the time, and it's much safer for people in the book, for example, to have it published like long, like books. I thought at the time that you can publish a book really fast, but it turns out it takes like a long time. So it's much safer now. It's out now, but like they're not in the detention center at the moment where it's referenced, so it's not like they can be, tortured or whatever because of something in the book, if that makes sense. So
yeah. My next question was going to be, do you believe reporting changes things? But it obviously does. And I suppose there is that, some proverb, I probably read this on Instagram now, that's the level of depth of proverbs I read. But that idea of that you can change one thing for one person, that's a very considerable change for them. Do you still think overall that reporting can change policies? Obviously, you've mentioned cases being brought to the ICC, and those things take time, but they do create change.
Yeah, like I'm a big believer in journalism. I like very, very much think that journalism is just so important. Having operated in a lot of environment where like you just see people's voices being silenced or squashed, and the exploitation and abuse that can happen when there isn't a light being shone on something. I like just really believe that journalism is so vital. But I mean, if you start thinking about change, you can get like incredibly depressed, as I personally know for many reasons, and lose your motivation. And also sometimes like the consequences cannot be what you anticipated. And I just think thinking about consequences is like not healthy really, because obviously you should risk assess like the consequences for your sources and stuff. But yeah, like I don't like report things because I'm like, oh, maybe this person. And also, to be honest, like when I started reporting this, I got it. I mean, it's in the book as well. I got invited over to the European Parliament, for example, and they brought me around like a lot of MEPs, and the MEPs would be like, what do you want me to do? And I'd be like, I'm not a lobbyist. Like, but also I was like, this is actually a waste of my time, because what I want is for nobody to be able to say that they don't know this is happening. And I'm not going to do that on an individual level with someone because the response from MEPs, by the way, often would be like, well, people generally know that this is happening, but unless the European public actually care about it, we're not going to do anything because we don't want to be voted out in the next election. And they'd be like, the European public basically don't care about Africans. Like, they don't care about black refugees or black migrants. And that would be the actual response. Like, and they're like, unless the European public care, we won't do anything. And like, that's like really horrible to hear. And also, I don't know. My mind isn't. And the other problem, I mean, this whole book came out of, like, this whole issue came out of a loophole. So basically, I haven't even explained really the European role in it. But basically, what's happening in the Central Mediterranean, which is known as the world's deadliest migration route, is that the EU since 2017 has been So there was this court decision in 2012, I think, the Hershey decision, which said that Italian boats cannot return people from Libya. So what you have in Libya is like people escaping loads of different situations, dictatorships, wars, also extreme poverty, and gathering in Libya and trying to cross into Italy by sea. And what the EU has been doing to try and stop people from arriving. And a lot of those people, by the way, if they can get onto European territory, they can claim international protection. They would have a right to make a refugee claim that would probably be accepted. Certainly a lot of people that I was in touch with. And what the EU has been doing is trying to stop them from reaching its territory. And initially, Italian boats were returning people to Libya, and that was ruled illegal. And so instead, the EU found a workaround. So it flies surveillance, drones, helicopters, planes over the central Mediterranean, spots the boats of refugees and migrants, and then supports the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept those boats. And so people are forced back to Libya, locked up indefinitely, without charge or trial, and basically subjected to various kind of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And that's a circumnavigation of international law, because it's basically a way of avoiding it being a European vessel that returns to people, which would not be legally allowed. And so people, like, they ask me to propose policies, and I'm like, if I propose a policy, like, they're very good at finding loopholes, you know? So maybe the next thing is going to be something worse. And it's very dangerous, I think, to be a journalist proposing policies, because everybody can just discredit all of your work if whatever you suggest, you know, if they do find that loophole, it'll be like a way to discredit your work. And like I said, I'm like one person who's like not, you know, I don't know, I just feel like that's not my role. My role is just exposing what's happening. So yeah, in terms of creating change, I don't know, because I've met a lot of people now who have been like, this book has changed their thinking, it's changed their framing. One thing I wanted to do was make people question when they hear sound bites, for example, like, you know, tackling the business model of people smugglers, or jumping the queue, you know, for refugee resettlement. Like, all of these things at least get people thinking, what does that actually mean? You know, when the EU says migration management, what are the human consequences of that? And what are the kind of bigger structures that may be failing? And whose voices are we actually listening to? And are we listening to the right voices when we create these policies and when we implement these policies? And so for me, I want people to ask questions, to inform themselves and ask questions, rather than me telling them what to think. And like, some people have read the book. Well, certainly one guy on Amazon read the book and was like, it's yeah, he was like, it's convinced me that we should allow no migration. And I was like,
wow, that's quite a takeaway.
Yeah, like, I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying that, like, yeah, I think people informing themselves is really, really important, rather than me telling them, you know, this is what you should think exactly, if that makes sense.
Yeah. One thing that comes up in the book kind of over and over again, to me anyway, was the hypocrisy of us as EU citizens and our politicians and our institutions, and where that was the kind of at its starkest, as you mentioned, our attitude to Black Africans and African refugees and migrants, and the Black Lives Matter motion in the European Parliament. We have this really interesting tendency to judge America on the racial disparities there, but while ignoring the fact that, as you say, the most dangerous migration route actually is here, and we're complicit in that. Again, I suppose it's similar to my other question, really, but at what point did you realise the extent of that hypocrisy and how complicit kind of the population is in it?
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the beginning, like, I'm not someone who's trying to recreate other people's stories, and I only report on things. I mean, I do daily news, so obviously everybody does like a bit. I'll do like, there's an election here or whatever, which obviously other people do. But like, something like this, I like dedicated years of my life to it. You know, I'm still talking about it now, which, like, now we're five years on from when I got that first message, and the only reason I'm doing that is because I think it's like so important, and partially that is, I mean, largely that's because this is being done in my name. Like, so I realized very early, probably in those first few days, like, actually, this is policy that is being implemented in my name. I'm a European. This, like, I am complicit in this. And that kind of sense of shock was what propelled me on. Like, that's why I'm still speaking about this now, you know. And yeah, I realized that very early. And like, it's not fair to just say nobody cares, or that, like, yeah, of course we're all complicit. That's not arguable at all. But like, it's not fair to say that people don't care. I think like one of the things that I became aware of is that structures have been built up to that, like some purposefully and some not so purposefully, like, you know, reducing journalism budgets, for example, mean that we use those UN statements without question. But like some have been built up purposefully to make sure that we're not hearing these voices. And some terms are being used, yeah, like the terms, the language, everything that's being used is like removing us from the human consequences of what is happening. And I think it's, yeah, like I said, it's not fair to say that that's, you know, everybody's willfully ignorant, but like I do think that we have a duty to inform ourselves at the same stage. And yeah, like, and you know, one of the worst things actually, like, is that I actually was a migration focused reporter for like a good while before I found out this story. And actually it's a lie to say that I didn't know it, because I had heard kind of broadly about it, but like I hadn't until you're actually talking to somebody directly who has been implicated or who has been involved in this. You don't really realize, or at least I hadn't realized, you know, the kind of actually reality, like the scale of it and the reality of that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things that you say in the afterword is, you say you're never asked how we can avoid becoming immune to the inequality. Is there a how?
Yeah, people keep asking me this as well, and honestly, I find it really...
It's because you say in the afterword that you're never asked about it.
I know, but I find it really difficult. Like, when I started doing publicity for this book, actually, I kept being asked by people, like, is there hope, is there hope? And I found that very hard, because every time somebody asked me, I would feel less like there is hope.
Yeah.
And, like...
It's not your job to say if there's hope, is it?
No, I'm not saying that, but like it would be me. I would start losing my feeling that I needed to keep working on this, and I actually was like, I need to kind of monitor this, because I still feel like it's so important. But like, yeah, I feel like you can just get really ground down, and like I say in the book, like, how often do you like turn away from like this type of news, and yeah, at the same stage, like, it's been pretty amazing. I mean, I say it in the paperback afterward, that one of the things that has been amazing is like the fact, for example, that all you guys are here. Like, at the start, when I started reporting this, it was like you're screaming into a black hole, you know, or you're being told like, no, this is wrong. Like, you know, there's examples in the book where I was told by UN officials, for example, one told me like, don't believe refugees, like they always lie, basically. And like, obviously I was verifying everything, but like part of you kind of goes, oh, maybe they're telling the truth. But actually, yeah, like more and more people are becoming aware, more and more people are listening, and it doesn't just have to be me that's finding that hope or those ways to change. It can be other people who decide how they're going to interpret that and whether they're going to take action or what they're going to do. And I mean, for example, like Michael T. Higgins has now read the book, like, which was pretty wild. I met him. He went to Senegal, and he told me I was in Senegal covering his visit, and in January, and yeah, he told me that he's read it, and all these things I never would have possibly imagined. And so you don't know. Like, one thing actually that like people have been contacting me a lot, like medical workers or people who work with asylum seekers in different parts of Europe, who have been saying that, for example, they've seen like injuries on people they're working with, but they didn't know where they came from, and the person wouldn't tell them, like, because people, like what I discovered as well, once you're out of an environment, you don't really want to speak about it. You just want to forget it and move on with your life. And, you know, it's very humiliating to go through these types of experiences. And because I was in touch with people while they were going through them, that's how I got the information. But if I was interviewing people after they left, they want to move on, you know, they want to go back to doing other things with their life, which is totally understandable. And the people who've been messaging me, for example, one person, they said, you know, a man had told her that he had very poor eyesight from being in Libyan detention, and she didn't know what that meant. And then she read the book, and there's a scene in it where a lot of people are suddenly let out of detention, and they're in the sunshine, and they haven't seen sunshine, some of them, in years, and they like can't open their eyes properly. And she was like, now I understand what he was talking about. And so on all these different levels, you have people who I guess are getting more understanding. And by the way, this is only like one type of, refugee migration story. There are obviously so many different ones. This is not to say that this is what everyone has been through. And also this is only like the tip of the iceberg in terms of the information that I receive from Libya. And that's definitely only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the reality of what's happening. And now we have, there's so many things to follow that we don't have time to go into them. But Tunisia now has just become the more common route. And the EU has just done $1 billion, potentially is doing a €1 billion aid deal with Tunisia, which is partially focused on stopping migration. They're talking about deals with, or maybe they've done it with Egypt, Morocco, and Sudan. Now we know there's a war, but the RSF who are fighting in that war are said to have been emboldened and certainly indirectly benefited from EU funding aimed at stopping migration. And so Libya is like one example of what's happening, but actually there's a lot of other countries now where money is just being pumped in to try and stop people from getting to European territory. And actually it's like either propping up dictatorships, militias, or in Sudan, at least, it's hard to say exactly how much, but certainly contributing to the fact that there's a devastating war there now. And that's Sudanese people there will tell me that all the time.
Yeah, there's an awful lot there. We could probably talk for another hour, I'd say, very easily, but we are getting to the end of our time. I'm conscious of that, and I'm conscious people will probably have questions. I had two questions that I want to finish up with. You mentioned in the book, there's a couple of people whose stories are charted throughout the book. You mentioned one of the women that you had dealt with in Libya came to Dublin. There's obviously not that many who end up in Ireland from Libya, particularly because of our kind of limited enough resettlement numbers. In terms of the refugees who end up here, whatever route they've taken, and that growing protest movement against them, I know you're out of Ireland most of the time, so you're probably not following it very closely. But what do you think of that, or what have you seen of it?
Yeah, you're right. I haven't been following it so closely. I personally know two plus a baby, three, I guess, people who were in Libya that I was in communication with who are now in Ireland, and they know various others. And generally, I think they're doing quite well. They like the country, they like the people. They've had various issues with direct provision and housing and all of that. And yeah, one guy has really perfected a Dublin accent. So he was saying when he sees anyone who might be, a bit aggressive because of his skin color, he'll do a strong Dublin accent. And then he's from Somalia, and so he's kind of that's his way of dealing with it, I guess. And I don't think I'm the right person to comment on it, but it's frightening, I suppose it's, I guess.
It's you've written, was it Essie who you went to visit in Sweden?
In Luxembourg.
There's
a few guys in Sweden.
But one thing that really is very, it's quite upsetting, the whole book is upsetting, just to give you a clear warning on that, but that is quite upsetting is that when people have got to the end of their journey and where they thought they wanted to go, that this profound loneliness comes on them. And I suppose Irish people know about migration, you mentioned that in the book too, and anybody who is a migrant or who knows migrants knows that is always a piece of them that's missing, and that even if they've migrated under the happiest of circumstances, which obviously these people haven't, but that the rates of depression and suicide are quite high among refugees once they have made that journey and got to where they were going. I mean, that's astonishingly difficult to kind of to think about. And then the fact that they may be meeting protests and harassment on the other end as well. Just it's very, very difficult. Is that experience of kind of the difficulty not being resolved when they do reach their destination, were you surprised about that, or was that something you kind of knew going into it?
Yeah, I was very surprised, and to be honest, I think I've been learning a lot about trauma that I didn't know. Like, I wasn't an expert in any sense in trauma. And what I hadn't realized was, to be honest, like both me and the people I was in touch with were kind of in like a fight or flight mode to a certain extent when they were in Libya. Like, we were all thinking like, just what's the next thing we can do? What's going to make a difference? You know, all the time you're focused on that. And when people got out, and not everyone gets out, but like there's people who ended up all across Europe who I was in touch with, and for various different reasons, they would end up like very depressed. I mean, European society, the asylum systems can be very isolating, and so first of all, you're never trusted. So it's like you're being asked again and again your story, but it's like not in a way that's anything you say can be used against you, and it can be like, you're asked, I can't even think of all the examples, but like, for example, prove this, prove that, and people will be like, why don't you have documentation? They're like, I've gone through like this, horrific detention situation and crossed the sea and all of, like, how am I meant to keep my documents with me, or just various different ways that you become, and also you're always aware that your status can be revoked. So it's like you might be going through this process for a very, very long time, and you don't know if you actually are going to be allowed to stay. And we've had even countries like Denmark, for example, that gave like Syrians right to stay, and then now has started sending them back to Syria. Like you don't feel secure. And so it's very difficult to become involved in a society where you don't feel secure or know who you can trust, and feel like speaking can be very dangerous. And then also like family reunification has been a big problem. Men often will go ahead because the route is so dangerous, and particularly for women, there's a lot of sexual abuse. And so often they'll send a man ahead, and then he'll apply for a family reunification to get the rest of the family over, but that can take years and years. And people will be like, well, why did I go through that? If one Eritrean, for example, who I was in Sweden with, was saying like, I'd rather just go back and die or be arrested, and spend a decade in prison and then get to see my children. Like, I didn't come here so I can be alone in an apartment. And he's working and everything, but it's like he did all of this for his family, and the family are in so much danger all the time. And he doesn't know when he's going to see them again. And also like, I think trauma is a very weird thing, and people, at least in Libya, they wouldn't be alone. Like, they would always be with other people, and then when you're alone, I think it can really hit you. And then strange language. And then also one thing that I hadn't appreciated either is like racism. People who are coming from Africa, this sounds probably very weird for an Irish audience, but like they might not have even realized that they're black, for example.
Yeah.
It's just normal for them, their skin color. And one guy got to Sweden, and he said, he speaks fluent Swedish now, and he overheard like one woman saying something in Swedish about him being a thief, and he said he just like went home and burst into tears because he was like, she's just saying that because of my skin color. I'm like, he's working, in a care home taking care of old people, and he like has 2 cats, and he's like just such a sweet guy, and he's trying to build his own guitar, and then he goes out in the street and someone says that he's a thief just because of his skin color. And I think a lot of people, they really, even just tiny things like you'll stand on the bus and someone will step away from you, or like people they hadn't really realized that was something that would really impact them so much. And so that's not to say that, I mean, if you fled a dictatorship, it's still like technically, it's safer to be in Europe, but like at what cost to your mental health and your dignity and your sense of self and all of those things. And like a lot of the people in Libya, they'd say they just feel like everything has been stripped from them. Like the people I was in touch with, they were like doctors, dentists, musicians, artists, and suddenly everything that you are, all of your history, all of your family, like everything that makes you is suddenly taken away from you, and you're just seen as, or even for them, they'd be like, if you come from Eritrea, you've maybe never met a West African before. Like Essie, who's in the book, he was like, I thought that they just have like jungles, like National Geographic in West Africa. Like he never knew that there's cities in West Africa, and he met West Africans, and he was like, wow, like you guys are actually like, I don't know, he had this weird image of them all wearing like tribal outfits all the time or something. And then like for them, suddenly for them, they're like, now we're all being lumped together as one mass, even though like we're so different. So anyway, that was a long answer, but I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people here who work with refugees and migrants and asylum seekers who have, experienced this stuff too or heard about it.
No, that's actually is a perfect note to end on, because I think it gives the really human side of it. Essie comes across a great character, by the way. He seems like a lot of crack, despite everything that he's been through. He really he kind of shines out the book a little bit, I think. I suppose that's the overwhelming thing about this book is the human side of it, and the fact that rather than reading headlines or numbers or 300 die on this boat or 220 die on that boat, that you're reading about the stories and the people and the circumstances and how they got to be there in the first place. And it does make you think a bit about what's behind the headlines. I'm going to open up to the floor now, because I am conscious we are way over time. And I
Sorry.
know do you need to check your phone or anything?
No, it's okay.
She's on a deadline.
Or maybe I will. Sorry, I was saying I did a front page story, like literally right there, on migration, by the way. So everyone buy the Irish Times, because they're very...
You should buy the Examiner as well, by the way. You look at that, and I'll see if anybody has a question. You're okay, are you? We do have a roving mic, so if there's anyone, just stick up your hand. Yeah, there's a lady here, 2 ladies here in the front that have questions, if we can get a mic up to them. Thanks, Alice. These 2 ladies over here.
Thanks very much for your story. And I've read the book. In the very beginning, you say a portion of the proceeds from this book will be donated to refugee supporting initiatives. Can you say a bit more about that? Because you're not specific in it, so we don't know where to donate to.
Yeah, I mean, I can say something about that, but yeah, it's kind of very deliberately vague, because basically I'm not giving through organizations, because for journalistic reasons, partially I don't give to organizations, and secondly, you can come to your own deductions as to how they come across in the book, but more directly to people who it will help, or kind of people who are arranging help for other people, if that makes sense. But people keep asking me which charity to donate to, and I'm like, again, I don't advise on charities, so. And the award money, by the way, well, I don't think that's relevant, but in the afterward, in the paperback, I also said I'm giving all the award money away, which I have done. It's won a bit of money now.
Great.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks. It was just a clarification I needed.
Yeah, sorry. I know it sounds strange, but it's vague on purpose, just because of protecting people.
Makes
and also
sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the other lady there, yeah.
I'm Magella McCarran, missionary to Africa for a long time, and in Ireland as long again. Sally, I'm really, really delighted with you as a writer for the Irish Times. And probably that's why I'm here, because I now read, and I just say, thank God somebody is remembering Africa. Because politically, it's a very important place. And both our own governments and African governments, they do care about reputational damage. And the more you load it on, the better, because that is so important for diplomacy. So I'm delighted to meet you. I worked with Ken Saro-Wiwa back in the Ogoni days. I brought you a book of his letters, and the title of it is so appropriate, Silence Would Be Treason. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I have to say, the Irish Times has been amazing for me. At least until recent, we were talking about this earlier, RTE technically now have an Africa correspondent as well. I'm not sure how much coverage they're running right now, but the Irish Times for quite a long time, I was the only one that was actually based in Africa and doing coverage, and it just astounds me, because it's a continent of 1.4 billion people. The population is meant to double. Well, I think it's meant to reach 2.5 by 2050, and it's such a fascinating it's a continent. It's so big. There's so many different countries. I think Irish people have really been deprived of the range of coverage that is possible from there. And I think, I mean, we were talking about this earlier too. I mean, there's so many like Irish people of African heritage now as well in Ireland, and like, I don't like, yeah, I keep meeting people who will be like, you know, everybody just thinks my country is only this thing, and I'm like, that's, so like in the Irish Times, for example, we ran like a series of stories that were like, you know, the tech scene in Nigeria, the, you know, the film community in Ghana. Like, we're just trying to do a range of coverage, but yeah, it shouldn't just be me. We should have like so many journalists that are covering it for the Irish media, and I really don't understand why not. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Is there somebody over here? Yeah, somebody down here at the back.
Sorry.
Some job getting in there, else.
Thanks. The question about hope that you were asked before, I think in some ways the interviewer, you're right in saying, you know, it's not necessarily your role to give people hope. But I suppose one thing I wondered is, given the stories that you encountered and the people that you met and their desire to share their stories with you and their like willingness and desire to see those stories shared, and I wonder, did that in of itself give you some hope in human nature, like their resilience and their ability to, I suppose, keep up the communication with you, but keep going despite the incredibly difficult circumstances they're living through?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always find the word resilience like a bit awkward, because like nobody should have to go through what people are going through, and so like resilience, I've heard people reference who are stuck in horrible environments, you know, this boiling frog thing, which I'm going to get completely wrong now, but it's like the water keeps getting hotter around you and you just like keep acting normal even though you're dying. Is that that explanation?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, resilience, it's like a really, yeah, it's a tricky word, because it's like you're saying that people should have to be like that. I don't know, like some people that I was in touch with, they just like really gave up and became incredibly depressed, and other people kept going, but like they were kind of hoping that there would be change, and I don't know if I can say that gave me hope or not. Like some of the people now that they're out of Libya, they just want to forget about it, and they could like be going around talking about it and raising awareness, but actually they're like, I just want to move on with my life now. I think anyone who's been through that type of horrific situation, they can manage that how they want. There should be no obligation on them to have to act in any particular way or to have to help. I don't know if that sounds bad, but like have to speak about it, you know? And yeah, but yeah, I mean, people are amazing, and I did cover, I don't know if I put it enough in the book actually, but like there were so many acts of charity inside the detention centers, people helping each other, people helping people, you know, with tuberculosis, for example, risking getting it themselves, people just doing kind things for each other generally, people paying money even towards each other. A lot of this, you know, when people are held for ransom, for example, there will be like a crowdfunding. So like diaspora communities will all contribute money to try and get somebody freed. And that's like, it's incredible, but it shouldn't be happening, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a tricky one, but yeah, you can't, humans are good and bad. Like there's, you know, humans do amazing things, and of course that should be celebrated, and it gives you hope, and then you feel sad, and then you feel happy, and then you feel sad, and sometimes I'm like, everything is pointless and hopeless, and sometimes I'm like, maybe something will make a difference, and I'm sure everyone here feels the same about, like that in different ways. But yeah, that wasn't a very good answer, but anyway.
Don't think there is a straightforward answer to that one, but there's a hand up back here, yeah. Oh, sorry, there's somebody here as well, yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to try not to ramble. I just recently finished a master's in human rights and intercultural heritage, so I've been reading a lot of stuff about migration for the last 3 years, because it was in Italy, so it was like a long course. And I just want to initially say that this book is incredible and so important, because often we have like the perspective is, as you say, like from the experts and the like academics and professionals and stuff, and not nearly enough of on the ground like knowledge of what's happening. And I did my thesis as well using like participatory research, which is like when you make sure you are providing the perspective of the people who you're actually talking about. And yeah, I just think it's an incredible piece of work, and there needs to be more like it. But I was just wondering if you're working on anything else of this volume at the moment, or any other like things with migration that you're looking into for the future.
Yeah, I am working on another book. I'm not sure how much migration is going to be in it, but it is kind of about crises, I guess, in different countries that I've reported on. But it's not coming out for 2 years, so nobody pre-order it yet. But yeah, in terms of migration, I'm trying to cover it. Yeah, I'm covering it for the Irish Times. I mean, even my story tomorrow is about migration, the Atlantic route up West Africa. But yeah, it's kind of weird, like basically like a book. I didn't know anything about writing a book. Like this is like the first time I wrote a book, and basically you like published a book, and I was thinking, you know, the day it got published, like I couldn't sleep at all. I was like, oh my God, it's going to be out in the world and everything's going to change. I think you can all tell this has been the recurring, like my recurring behavior for years, that I always think something is going to change. And the book got published, and the next day obviously like nobody's read it, and then they give you the sales figures and you're like, wow, like really nobody's even bought it, so they can't read it. And then you learn about publicity, so you have to go around and talk about the book to get people to buy it. And then, yeah, basically that's what I've been doing, trying to actually get people to read it. So I'm so grateful to anybody, but first of all, everybody here for like actually coming. Secondly, anybody who's actually read it. I didn't think anyone would be able to read it, because I was trying to find a balance between making it readable and also getting enough facts in that, you know, this was actually acting as a proper documentation of the reality. And, you know, like I said, it was playing some role in the quest for accountability. And so it kind of like interrupted a little bit my migration reporting, because like you just don't know how it's going to be received. And so I was like, I was honestly so scared, like before it came out. Now I think maybe I was too soft, but like at the time I was like, you know, when I was working on it, I did receive like death threats. I received warnings from CIA and MI6 that my life was in danger. Like I said, I was under criminal investigation for a year, accused of being a smuggler. And so like I was so frightened because I didn't know what the reaction would be, and that made me quite scared to report. And when it got published, I was like, okay, I'll talk about it, but I don't really want to poke any more bears right now. So let's just see how it goes. And it's actually coming out next month in Dutch. And in Holland, the government has just fallen as a result of migration policy. So that's going to be interesting. And it's coming out in September in Italy. So I'm doing publicity for both of those. So that's a long way of saying I am still doing migration reporting, but like very in depth. I've just been treading a bit gently, because also you don't want to do something badly and then have somebody use that to invalidate your very in-depth work, if that makes sense. So yeah, I've just been a bit careful.
I don't think you're too soft. I think if MI6 and the CIA told me my life was in danger, I'd probably never be seen again. So I don't think you're too soft. There was somebody back at the back here with a question as well. Yeah.
Just a very quick question. Thank you so much. It's been inspirational listening to you. So you mentioned about how in your reporting you try to focus on the gaps, the stories that aren't being told. So I was wondering, what are the current gaps that you see perhaps from your work in Africa, especially in relation to migration?
Yeah, I mean, in Africa, there's like a lot of gaps. There are great African journalists, by the way, doing great work that doesn't get enough attention. But like I said, it's a massive continent, and particularly in terms of coverage that you would see in Ireland, I think it's very, very, very lacking. In terms of migration coverage, I just think there needs to be more and more reporting on where the money is being spent. And like I wasn't capable of doing all of that. Like, I mean, of course, because it's like a very kind of opaque system. So basically, since 2015, the EU has been spending billions of dollars through billions of euros. I keep saying dollars, sorry, through what's called the EU Trust Fund for Africa, and that was initially designated as crisis spending, and therefore there's not proper oversight of that money, and it's like. It's just, like, certainly my reporting, I mean, there's so much of it. It's been spent across 26 African countries, basically aimed at stopping migration. And some of it is, you know, going to things like, in Gambia, for example, they'll fund people to hold football matches, and in the middle they will give like a 15-minute talk on like why it's bad to try and reach Europe, and then they'll go back to playing football, and they might like pay for, you know, soft drinks or something for the attendees. And like it's everything from that to like the Libyan Coast Guard support to like funding the UN, to like tons of other things. But I just think that money, it's not been properly interrogated. And then Frontex is like the best funded EU agency, so that's the European Border Agency. And actually last year, after this book came out, it's again in the paperback if anyone wants to get it, the head of Frontex he resigned over human rights abuses, but like that was kind of seen by people who report on migration as a chance to properly interrogate what was going wrong in the agency, but that's not what's happened. The money is basically just still being pumped into the agency, and we've seen things like the pushbacks in Greece, you know, even the recent shipwreck and what the Greek Coast Guard's role in that was and what their association with Frontex is. I think that, Frontex, everything Frontex is doing. And also the thing is like the Europeans, I mean, even people who like for various reasons will say they don't want, you know, any migration to Europe or whatever. They still, I feel, should care about where their money is being spent. And I don't think that people realize the lack of oversight of that money. Like, even I'll talk to MEPs and they're like, we don't know where that money is being spent. Like, we can't get answers because it's the EU Commission that manages it. And, like, I don't know, it's just fair. And then the thing is also, like, who are the decision makers? Like, so there's two lawyers that I interview in this book who were initially trying to push the ICC to investigate the EU for crimes against humanity. And they were like, you know, the system is so opaque that we don't actually know who's making a lot of the decisions. And again, the MEPs will say they don't know who's making the decisions, and they'll try to put questions to the Commission. They won't get proper responses, or the responses will take a lot of time and be very vague. So there's a lot going on there, and it's like not... You know, it's like obviously one person can't do it. Probably like a whole team of journalists still would struggle, but there's people who are trying. One good outlet is called Lighthouse Reports. They've been doing very good reporting on European migration policy and forensic architecture as well. They were doing good stuff. They were like kind of recreating with 3D shipwrecks and looking at the role that the EU had played in them. Yeah, so I'm not trying to pretend like this is just me who's reporting on this, but anyway, that was also a really long answer, sorry.
It's okay. I'm going to take one more question, and I think then we're done, time-wise. And there isn't one more. We're done. Oh, there is. There's always one. Yeah. Mike, on its way to you, and then we're done, okay?
Hi, Sally. Just in relation to Africa and the way climate change is impacting on the continent, one would assume that migration is just going to get increased rather than decrease. It's not going away anytime soon. So do you see any possibility that proper procedures will be put in place to deal with it, either on the continent itself or in Europe?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a very big topic. And what they're saying is that for every degree Celsius that the temperature rises globally, that 1 billion people will be displaced, I think. And I mean, I've seen it. I was in Somalia twice last year, where there's this terrible drought that is said to be a result of climate change. And I think 1 million people had been displaced by August last year as a result of it. And I was in displacement camps where you see people who arrive with nothing. And these were like very proud people who had always existed off livestock. They had kept camels or they had kept goats and they had always got by, and suddenly their whole herd is like dead and they have nowhere to go, and they're reliant on aid agencies, and the aid agencies weren't doing distributions. And I mean, I was in one camp in Somalia in December where I counted 101 graves of children that had all died in the last, I think it was 2 or 3 months. And it's absolutely horrific. And when you think about it, like the rich, I think Ireland, I had to reread my afterword today, that's why I keep referencing it. I think Ireland has 1/3 of the population of Somalia and produces around 50 times the emissions. And like the rich world basically is producing the emissions and developing countries are suffering. And at the same stage, like all we're seeing, basically what we're seeing is like borders being erected, securitization. It's very short term. Like the thing about politics, and this is what politicians will tell me, is that they're thinking short term because they want to be re-elected. So they're trying to stop migration very quickly, which is basically involves funding systems that are highly abusive, that are causing greater long-term problems. And I really don't know what's going to happen. I just think that it's quite terrifying. And also one thing that really made me think, and this was after I finished the book, was that when I was in Somalia again, I would meet people so I didn't see any food being distributed by international aid organizations, but I did see food being distributed by local business people, and they said that the money to buy it was being sent by people in Europe, by Somalis in Europe who were doing whip rounds, sending direct money, and that was going basically to buy food, and there's no overheads to that, it's like literally you get the money sent, and you use it directly to buy food and help people. And for Somali families, like if they have one person who's in the West, that person can support the entire family. And it really made me think about like foreign aid and how we look at foreign aid, because actually like allowing certain types of, or allowing as much migration as, I'm not proposing policy, but like allowing migration is a form of foreign aid, because you have a person then in a place where they can just work and send back money and support an entire family, and you're not like pumping huge amounts of money into organizations that have massive overheads, where very little may be reaching the people who need it. And so it's actually like a much more effective form of foreign aid. That's what I started thinking anyway, being in this environment. But probably what will happen is just increased securitization, and it's very frightening. Like this money, I talked to the son of like a political prisoner in Tunisia a few weeks ago. I think the story was in the Irish Times, and the Tunisia, like I said, the EU has just offered $1 billion in aid, basically to, again, with an understanding that migration will be stopped. And he was just saying like this, it's destabilizing many countries in the long term, and what's going to happen to them, I just don't know. It's very frightening.
A lot to think about there. Okay, I want to say thank you very much to Sally for coming this evening.
Yeah, thank you to you.